The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Michael Taylor checked his watch for the third time. He was running late, something that rarely happened in his 15 years on the bench. The district court judge hurried up the wide marble stairs, his mind racing through the details of the case that would begin in less than 20 minutes. Today was different from his usual routine. Instead of arriving early in his black sedan, dressed impeccably in a suit before donning his judicial robes, Michael wore dark jeans and a polo shirt under his sports coat. His son's championship basketball game had run into overtime, and he hadn't had time to go home and change. The gold watch on his wrist, a gift from his father when he passed the bar exam, showed 8:42 a.m. The hearing was set for 9 hours. "I'll change in my chambers," he muttered to himself, quickening his pace. The leather briefcase swung at his side as he took the steps 2 at a time, feeling the weight of his 53 years in his knees. The courthouse was already bustling with activity. Lawyers clutched coffee cups and briefcases, chatting in small groups. Nervous defendants stood with family members speaking in hushed tones. Court reporters and clerks hurried through the halls with armloads of files. It was the normal morning chaos of the justice system grinding into motion. Michael reached the top step and headed toward the side entrance he'd used for years, a quieter, more direct route to his chambers on the 3rd floor. He nodded to a few familiar faces, though most people seemed too busy with their own concerns to notice him. As he approached the door, he noticed someone new. A white officer stood at attention, his uniform pressed and crisp, his posture suggesting he took his job very seriously. Michael didn't recognize him, which was unusual. After 15 years, he knew most of the courthouse security staff by name. The officer stepped forward as Michael reached for the door handle, placing his body between the judge and the entrance. "Excuse me, sir. This entrance is restricted to authorized personnel only." The officer's voice was firm but polite, his hand resting casually near his belt. Michael paused, a bit surprised. He'd used this entrance thousands of times without being questioned. For a moment he considered explaining who he was, but years of experience had taught him to stay calm in unexpected situations. "Good morning, officer," Michael replied with a small smile. "I'm Judge Taylor. I have a hearing in courtroom 3B at 9. The officer, whose name tag read Reynolds, looked him up and down, taking in the casual clothes and the briefcase. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. "I'll need to see some ID, sir," Officer Reynolds said, his tone unchanged. Michael felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, a feeling he'd known since childhood. Through college at Howard University, through law school, and even now, decades into a distinguished career, it was the weight of being seen as out of place, of having to prove he belonged. He'd learned to carry this weight with dignity, to not let it show on his face or hear it in his voice. "Of course," he said, setting his briefcase down and reaching for his wallet. By now, several people had slowed their pace to watch the interaction. Michael was well known and respected in the courthouse. His cases were often covered by local news, especially his innovative approach to juvenile justice that had reduced recidivism rates across the district. As he handed over his judicial ID, he noticed Diane from the clerk's office watching with a puzzled expression from across the lobby. She'd worked with him for over a decade, often staying late to help prepare for complex cases. Officer Reynolds studied the ID card with careful attention, turning it over in his hands as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. The second stretched uncomfortably. "Is there a problem, Officer Reynolds?" Michael asked, his voice steady but firm. The officer looked up, his expression unreadable. "This says you're a district court judge." "That's correct," Michael replied. Reynolds glanced again at Michael's casual clothes, then back at the ID. "Most judges I've seen come in through the main entrance, and they're usually wearing different clothes." The officer's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Michael took a slow, deep breath. He was now officially running late, and the last thing he needed was to begin a complex hearing rushed and frustrated. But he also recognized that this young officer was new and simply doing his job, even if there was perhaps something else influencing his skepticism. "I came straight from my son's basketball game," Michael explained patiently. "I'm going to change in my chambers before court begins. I've been using this entrance for 15 years. Officer Reynolds hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Diane from the clerk's office approached. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble floor as she walked over, file folders clutched against her chest. "Good morning, Judge Taylor," she said brightly. "I was just coming to bring you the updated files for the Henderson case." The prosecution submitted some last-minute evidence. The officer's posture changed almost imperceptibly. He handed the ID back to Michael with a nod. "Thank you, sir. Sorry for the delay." Michael accepted his ID, tucking it back into his wallet. "No need to apologize, officer. Security is important. I appreciate your diligence." His words were sincere despite the frustration of being delayed. As Reynolds stepped aside to let them pass, Michael felt the eyes of the small crowd that had gathered. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, a few understanding. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. "Thank you." "Diane?" Michael said as they walked through the door together. "New security guy," Diane whispered once they were inside. "Started last week. Been giving everyone a hard time." Michael nodded, but he couldn't help wondering if everyone truly meant everyone, or if some people moved through the world with less friction than others. It was a thought he'd had many times before, during traffic stops, in department stores, at airport security lines, and even here, in the building where he administered justice. They walked toward the elevator, Diane filling him in on the morning schedule and the details of the new evidence. Michael listened attentively, pushing the encounter to the back of his mind. He had work to do. "Will 15 minutes be enough time for you to review these before we start?" Diane asked as the elevator doors opened. "It'll have to be," Michael replied with a small smile. "And I need to change. Can you let courtroom 3B know I might be a few minutes late?" "Already texted the bailiff," Diane said, holding up her phone. "Everything's under control." The elevator carried them to the 3rd floor. As they stepped out, Michael caught a glimpse of himself in the reflective doors, the casual clothes so out of place in these formal halls. For a moment he saw himself through Officer Reynolds' eyes and understood the confusion, if not the skepticism. In his chambers, Michael quickly changed into the spare suit he kept hanging in his closet for emergencies. As he fastened his tie and slipped into his judicial robes, he thought about the young officer downstairs. There was something in Reynolds' face that had seemed familiar. Not recognition, but perhaps a quality Michael had seen in other young men he'd mentored over the years. The weight of the robe settled on his shoulders, bringing with it the responsibility he'd carried for 15 years. Today's case involved a 17-year-old first-time offender, a young man who, with the right intervention, might never see the inside of a courtroom again. As he prepared to leave his chambers, Michael made a mental note to learn more about Officer Reynolds. Something told him their paths would cross again, and next time he wanted the interaction to be different. He'd seen too many moments like this morning's become the seeds of lasting division. Sometimes, he thought, the most important work of justice happened outside the courtroom. With his robes properly in place and the case files tucked under his arm, Judge Michael Taylor stepped out of his chambers. The morning's encounter faded into the background as he focused on the day ahead. There was justice to be served, and that had always been his primary concern, no matter what obstacles appeared in his path. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Michael Taylor entered. Despite the morning's delay, he moved with purpose and calm authority. The wooden door closed behind him with a soft click as he took his place at the bench. No one watching would have guessed that just 20 minutes ago he'd been stopped at the side entrance like a stranger in his own courthouse. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the Honorable Judge Michael Taylor presiding. The rustle of movement filled the room as everyone stood. Michael scanned the courtroom quickly, taking in the faces of the lawyers, the young defendant, the boy's parents, and the small crowd of observers. His gaze briefly settled on a woman in the back row, a reporter from the local paper who covered most of his cases. "Please be seated," he said, arranging the case files Diane had given him. "We're here for the case of the state versus Thomas Walker. Are both sides ready to proceed?" As the attorneys confirmed they were ready, Michael pushed the morning's encounter from his mind. The young man sitting at the defense table deserved his full attention. Thomas was 17, caught breaking into a local business after hours. No violence, nothing stolen. Just a kid with no prior record who'd made a very bad decision. The hearing proceeded smoothly. Michael listened carefully to both sides, asking pointed questions about Thomas's home life, school performance, and future plans. The prosecutor argued for a harsh sentence to send a message, while the public defender highlighted the boy's clean record and the letter of apology he'd written to the business owner. When it was time to announce his decision, Michael leaned forward. "Mr. Walker," he addressed the teenager directly. "Stand up, please." The boy rose, his shoulders hunched. "Eyes downcast. Look at me," Michael said, his tone firm but not unkind. Thomas raised his eyes slowly, and Michael saw what he'd seen in countless young men who'd stood in that same spot. Fear, regret, and the weight of a future hanging in the balance. "I've been where you're standing," Michael said, surprising the courtroom with this personal revelation. "Not for breaking and entering, but I've known what it feels like to have people look at you and see only your worst mistake." The courtroom was utterly silent now. Even the court reporter's fingers had paused over her machine. "I'm sentencing you to 6 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service at the business you broke into, and weekly meetings with a mentor from our youth program." Relief washed over the boy's face, but Michael wasn't finished. "This is not a free pass. This is a chance, perhaps the only one you'll get, to prove that you are more than this one bad decision. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're adjourned," Michael announced, bringing down his gavel. As people filed out of the courtroom, Michael noticed the reporter hurrying toward the exit, no doubt rushing to file her story. He hoped she'd include his reasoning, not just the sentence itself. Too often, the public only saw the punishment, not the careful thought behind it. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of cases, each requiring his full attention. It wasn't until the lunch recess that Michael had a moment to reflect on what had happened at the entrance. He sat in his chambers, sandwich untouched on his desk, when a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Diane entered, a curious expression on her face. "Judge Taylor, Officer Reynolds is here. He's asking if he could speak with you for a moment." Michael raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Send him in." Diane stepped aside and Officer Reynolds entered the chambers. He stood ramrod straight, cap in hand, looking far less confident than he had that morning. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," Reynolds said. "I wanted to apologize for this morning. I should have recognized you." Michael gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit down, officer." Reynolds sat, perching on the edge of the seat as if prepared to spring up at any moment. "There's no need to apologize," Michael said. "You were doing your job. Security is important, especially these days. Still, sir, I feel I didn't handle it well." Reynolds twisted his cap in his hands, a nervous gesture that made him seem younger than he had appeared that morning. Michael studied the man more carefully now. Up close, he could see that Reynolds was probably in his late 20s, with clear blue eyes that held a hint of something. Shame, perhaps, or uncertainty. "How long have you been with Courthouse Security?" Michael asked. "Just transferred last week, sir. I was with the County Sheriff's Department before that, mostly rural patrol. That explains some things. The county surrounding the city was predominantly white, with small towns where everyone knew everyone else. Reynolds probably hadn't interacted with many black professionals in positions of authority. "It's a different world in here," Michael said, gesturing to the courthouse around them. "Lots of tension, high stakes. People's lives change based on what happens in these rooms." Reynolds nodded. "I'm learning that, sir." "Call me Judge Taylor," Michael said. "Or just Judge. Sir makes me feel like my father." A hint of a smile crossed Reynolds' face. "Yes, Judge Taylor." Michael leaned back in his chair, making a decision. "I have a question for you, Officer Reynolds. This morning when you stopped me, was it only because of the casual clothes and the side entrance, or was there something else?" The direct question hung in the air between them. Reynolds' face flushed slightly and his eyes dropped to his cap. I'm not sure what you mean, Judge." "I think you do," Michael said gently. "And I'm not asking to put you on the spot or to make an accusation. I'm genuinely curious about what went through your mind." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment and Michael let the silence stretch, a technique he often used in his courtroom to encourage honesty. Finally, Reynolds looked up. "When I saw you approaching the door, you didn't look like what I expected a judge to look like. And not just because of the clothes. Because I'm black," Michael said simply. Reynolds winced but nodded. "I've never worked with a black judge before. Where I grew up, there weren't many black folks in positions like yours. Michael appreciated the honesty. It was refreshing compared to the carefully worded denials he'd heard throughout his career. "Thank you for being straightforward," he said. "Many people wouldn't have been." "I figured you'd see right through me if I tried to lie," Reynolds admitted. "You're a judge, after all." Michael laughed at that, a genuine laugh that seemed to surprise Reynolds. "I'm still learning," Reynolds continued. "I know I've got things to unlearn, assumptions I make without even realizing it." "We all do," Michael said. "Every single one of us." Reynolds looked at him with surprise. "Even you?" "Even me," Michael confirmed. "I have assumptions about young white officers from the county, don't I? We're all works in progress." A thoughtful silence fell between them. Michael glanced at his watch, aware that afternoon sessions would begin soon. "I should let you get back to work," Reynolds said, noticing the gesture. "Actually," Michael said, making another decision, "I have an idea. Do you have plans after your shift today?" Reynolds shook his head. "No, Judge. I'm hearing an interesting case this afternoon. Armed robbery, but there are some unusual circumstances. If you'd like to observe, I think you might find it educational. Afterward, maybe we could grab coffee and discuss it." The surprise on Reynolds' face was evident. "You'd want me to sit in on your court? After this morning?" "Especially after this morning," Michael replied. "The courthouse isn't just a building, Reynolds. It's a community, and communities grow stronger when people talk to each other, not just past each other." Reynolds stood, a new respect visible in his posture. "I'd be honored, Judge Taylor. My shift ends at 3. Perfect. The case starts at 3:30. Courtroom 3B. Michael rose as well, extending his hand. "And bring questions. That's how we all learn." As they shook hands, Michael felt a familiar sense of possibility, the same feeling he had when a defendant like young Thomas Walker walked out of his courtroom with a second chance. Not every seed planted would grow, but that never stopped him from planting them. After Reynolds left, Diane poked her head in. "Everything okay?" Michael smiled. "Yes, I think it might be the start of something interesting." "You and your projects," Diane said with a knowing look. "Always finding people with potential." "It's part of the job," Michael replied, gathering his robes for the afternoon session. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. Sometimes it's about creating the space for people to become better than they were yesterday." As he headed back to his courtroom, Michael felt the weight he'd carried that morning beginning to lift. Perhaps Officer Reynolds would take this opportunity, and perhaps he wouldn't. But the choice to offer it, that was within Michael's power. And in a world where so many things weren't, that counted for something. Courtroom 3B had nearly emptied when Officer Reynolds slipped in through the back door. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Only a few people remained. A court reporter packing up her equipment, a janitor collecting discarded papers, and Judge Michael Taylor still seated at the bench, writing notes on a legal pad. Reynolds stood awkwardly by the door, unsure if he should approach or wait to be acknowledged. He'd changed from his uniform into civilian clothes, jeans and a simple blue button-down shirt that made him look younger, less official. Michael looked up, noticing the officer. With a small nod, he motioned Reynolds forward. "You missed the case," Michael said, closing the folder in front of him. "It ended earlier than expected." "I'm sorry, Judge. My shift supervisor needed some paperwork completed before I could leave." Reynolds stopped at the railing that separated the gallery from the court proper. Michael gathered his notes and stepped down from the bench. Without his robes, dressed now in a simple dark suit, he seemed more approachable but no less dignified. "No need to apologize. These things happen." Michael gestured toward the door. "How about that coffee?" "There's a decent place across the street." The cafe was busy with the after-work crowd. Lawyers, clerks, and courthouse staff mingled with downtown office workers, all seeking a caffeine boost before heading home. Michael led Reynolds to a small table in the corner, away from the main traffic flow. "I come here to think sometimes," Michael said as they settled with their drinks. Black coffee for Reynolds, tea for the judge. "It's a good place to watch people when you're stuck on a difficult case." Reynolds looked around, taking in the diverse crowd. "I can see why. Lots of different types here." "That's what I like about it," Michael agreed. "In my courtroom, everyone has a role to play. Defendant, prosecutor, witness. But here they're just people living their lives." An awkward silence fell between them. Reynolds stared into his coffee cup as if searching for the right words. "Judge Taylor, can I ask you something?" he finally said, looking up. Michael nodded. "That's why we're here. How do you do it? Deal with people like me all day. People who make assumptions about you before they even know who you are?" The directness of the question surprised Michael. He'd expected to ease into their conversation, perhaps discuss the case Reynolds had missed. But the young officer wasn't wasting time with small talk. "I don't see you as a type, Reynolds," Michael replied carefully. "This morning you were an officer doing your job, albeit with some unconscious biases at work. Now you're just a man having coffee, trying to understand something complicated. But it happens to you all the time, doesn't it?" Reynolds pressed. "Being stopped, questioned, people assuming you don't belong?" Michael took a slow sip of his tea, considering how much to share. "The first time I walked into a courtroom as a judge, wearing my robes, a white woman asked me to bring her a glass of water. She thought I was the custodian." Michael smiled slightly at the memory. "When I told her I was the judge, she turned so red I thought she might faint." Reynolds winced. "What did you do?" "I got her the water," Michael said simply. "Then I presided over her divorce case with as much fairness as I could muster." "That's not what I would have done," Reynolds admitted. "What would you have done?" "Honestly, I probably would have been angry. Would have wanted her to feel as small as she made me feel." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That's a natural reaction. And there have been times, plenty of times, when I've felt that anger. But I learned something important early in my career. If I let those moments define me, I'd spend my whole life being angry." "So you just let it go?" Reynolds sounded skeptical. "Not exactly. I acknowledge it. I process it. Sometimes I talk about it with people who understand, but I don't let it consume me." Michael leaned forward. "And more importantly, I try to use those experiences to make things better for the next person." The cafe had grown quieter as the initial rush subsided. Through the window, they could see people hurrying home, the workday over. "I didn't grow up around many black people," Reynolds said after a moment. "My hometown was pretty much all white. The first black person I really talked to was my drill sergeant in the Army." "And what was that like?" Michael asked. Reynolds laughed. "Terrifying. But not because he was black, because he was a drill sergeant. He didn't care what color anyone was. He just wanted us to follow orders and become soldiers. Sometimes shared experiences can bridge differences," Michael observed. "You had something in common, the military." "Yeah, I guess so." Reynolds seemed to be thinking deeply. "Can I tell you something else? Something I'm not proud of?" "Go ahead." "When I saw you this morning, before I even consciously thought about it, I felt suspicious, like something wasn't right. It wasn't a decision I made. It just happened." Reynolds looked ashamed. "What does that say about me?" Instead of answering immediately, Michael turned and pointed to a young woman sitting alone at a table across the cafe. She wore torn jeans, had multiple piercings, and was typing intensely on a laptop covered with stickers. "What's your first thought when you see her?" Michael asked. Reynolds glanced over. "College student, probably. Working on a paper or something. Now her." Michael nodded toward an elderly man in a worn suit reading a newspaper. "Retired, maybe. Probably comes here every day to read the paper." "And him?" Michael indicated a muscular man in workout clothes paying at the counter. "Gym guy. Protein shake after his workout." Michael turned back to Reynolds. "See what you just did? Your brain made instant assumptions based on appearance, clothing, age. That's what brains do. They take shortcuts based on past experiences, things we've seen, stories we've heard." Reynolds nodded slowly. "So everyone has these biases?" "Everyone," Michael confirmed. "The question isn't whether we have them, it's whether we recognize them and question them." "Like I'm doing now?" Reynolds asked hopefully. "Like you're doing now," Michael agreed. "That's the first step." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Outside, the streetlights had come on, casting pools of yellow light on the sidewalk. "I wanted to be a lawyer once," Reynolds said suddenly. "Back in high school, I was on the debate team. My teacher said I had a knack for making arguments. What happened? Life. My dad got sick my senior year. College wasn't an option after that. I joined the Army. Then law enforcement seemed like a natural fit when I got out." He shrugged. "Dreams change. Or they get delayed," Michael suggested. "How old are you, Reynolds?" 29. I was 32 when I started law school. Had a whole career in business before that. Reynolds looked surprised. Really? Really? It's never too late. Michael pulled a business card from his wallet and slid it across the table. The local community college has a pre-law program. Evening classes for working adults. A friend of mine teaches there. Reynolds picked up the card, studying it with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. You think I could do it? I think you're asking the right questions, Michael replied. That's a good start. As they prepared to leave, Reynolds hesitated, then asked, Judge Taylor, why are you doing this? After how I treated you this morning, why help me? Michael stood, straightening his jacket. 20 years ago, a white judge named Arthur Thompson found me sitting alone in a courtroom after hours. I was a law clerk, studying for the bar exam. Instead of asking me what I was doing there, he asked me what case I was preparing for. When I told him I was studying, he sat down and spent 2 hours going over constitutional law with me. Did you pass? With flying colors, Michael smiled at the memory. Judge Thompson retired the year I was appointed to the bench. At his retirement party, he told me something I never forgot. He said, the law doesn't change society. People change society. The law just creates the space where change is possible. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. And you think I could be part of that change? I think we all are, whether we realize it or not. Michael extended his hand. The question is what kind of change we want to create. As they shook hands, Reynolds seemed different from the rigid, suspicious officer of that morning. More thoughtful, more human. Thank you for the coffee, Judge. And the conversation. It's Michael when we're not in the courthouse, the judge replied with a smile. I'm David, Reynolds offered. David Reynolds. Well, David, same time next week? You can tell me what you think of that pre-law program. The surprise on Reynolds' face gave way to a genuine smile. I'd like that, Michael. As they parted ways outside the cafe, the evening air cool against their faces, Michael watched Reynolds walk toward the parking garage. The young officer's steps seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted. Michael knew the feeling well, the weight that comes from seeing yourself through others' limited perceptions, and the freedom that comes from someone seeing your potential instead. He turned toward his own car, thinking about the cases waiting for him tomorrow. Each one represented a chance to uphold the law, yes, but also to create that space where change was possible. It wasn't always easy to see past his own biases, to look beyond the immediate facts to the human beings behind them. But days like today reminded him why it mattered. Sometimes justice wore a robe and carried a gavel. Other times it looked like two men sharing coffee and honest conversation, finding common ground where none seemed possible before. 6 months passed quickly. Winter melted into spring and spring blossomed into summer. The courthouse remained a constant. Cases came and went. Justice was served or sometimes just approximated, and the rhythm of legal life continued its steady beat. For Judge Michael Taylor and Officer David Reynolds, Thursday evenings became a fixture in their schedules. What had started as coffee after court evolved into a genuine mentorship. Sometimes they met at the cafe, sometimes at the law library, occasionally at a baseball game when they both needed a break from legal discussions. Today, they sat in Michael's chambers, books and papers spread across the coffee table. David had enrolled in the community college's pre-law program, taking classes 3 evenings a week after his shifts. Michael had become his unofficial tutor, guiding him through the complexities of constitutional law and legal precedent. I still don't understand how the Supreme Court justified this decision, David said, pointing to a passage in the textbook. It seems to contradict everything they said in the previous case. Michael leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Welcome to constitutional law. Sometimes it's about principles, sometimes it's about politics, and sometimes it's about 9 human beings trying to make sense of a document written over 200 years ago. David ran a hand through his hair, which had grown longer over the months. He looked different now, less rigid, more thoughtful. The change wasn't just in his appearance, but in how he carried himself. The courthouse staff had noticed it too. He'd become one of the most respected officers on the security team. I got an A on my first legal writing assignment, David said, changing the subject. Professor Wilson said my analysis was unusually nuanced for a first-year student. That doesn't surprise me, Michael replied. You've got a good mind for this work. You see the gray areas, not just black and white. David looked down, still uncomfortable with praise. It's all thanks to you, Judge. Michael, The judge corrected him for the 100th time. And no, it's not. I've just pointed you in some useful directions. The work has been all yours. A knock at the door interrupted them. Diane, the clerk who'd witnessed their first encounter months ago, poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, Judge, but the Chief Justice is on line 1. Says it's important, Michael nodded. Thank you, Diane, I'll take it. He turned to David. This might take a while. Chief Justice Bennett doesn't make social calls? No problem. I should get going anyway. I've got a paper due tomorrow. David gathered his books, now comfortable in the judge's chambers where he'd once stood so awkwardly. Same time next week? Actually, Michael said, I wanted to talk to you about that. There's a moot court competition at the law school next Friday. I'm one of the judges. Would you be interested in observing? David's eyes lit up. Are you kidding? I'd love to. Good, it starts at 6. I'll leave your name at the door. After David left, Michael picked up the phone. Chief Justice Bennett. What can I do for you, sir? The voice on the other end was warm but businesslike. Michael, I've been reviewing your community outreach programs. The Juvenile Intervention Initiative in particular has shown remarkable results. Recidivism down 30% in your district. Thank you, sir. We've been fortunate to have good people involved. It's more than good people, Michael. It's good leadership. A pause. That's actually why I'm calling. The Judicial Education Committee has an opening. We need someone with your perspective. Michael raised his eyebrows. The committee was prestigious, responsible for training new judges across the state. It was also a stepping stone to higher judicial appointments. I'm honored, sir, but my docket is already quite full. We'll adjust your caseload. This is important, Michael. The bench needs to reflect the communities it serves, not just in who sits on it, but in how we think about our role. After the call ended, Michael sat quietly, considering the opportunity. The committee would mean more work, more responsibility, but also more influence on how justice was administered throughout the state. He thought about the young defendants who came through his courtroom, about David Reynolds and his journey, about all the small ways change happened, person by person. His reflection was interrupted by another knock. This time it was the bailiff. Judge Taylor? There's a situation in the lobby you might want to handle personally. Michael frowned. What kind of situation? Officer Reynolds is involved. And that teenager you sentenced a while back, Thomas Walker. Michael hurried downstairs, concern growing with each step. He found a small crowd gathered in the lobby. In the center stood David, his hand on the shoulder of Thomas Walker, now 18 and looking terrified. A security guard from one of the shops across the street was gesturing angrily. What's happening here? Michael asked, his judicial authority evident even without his robes. The shop security guard turned. This kid was loitering outside my store looking suspicious. When I approached him, he ran. Seems guilty to me. I wasn't doing anything wrong, Thomas protested. I was waiting for my mom to pick me up after my community service. This guy came at me like I was robbing the place. David stepped forward. I saw the whole thing, Judge. Thomas was just standing there. The guard was overly aggressive in his approach. Michael took in the scene. Thomas in his work clothes, clearly having come from his community service. The guard, red-faced and defensive. David, standing protectively beside the teenager. Thomas has been completing his community service across the street for the past 6 months, Michael explained to the guard. He's known to this court and has been meeting all the requirements of his probation. The guard seemed to deflate slightly. Well, he shouldn't have run, perhaps Michael acknowledged. And perhaps you might consider why a young black man might feel unsafe when aggressively approached by security. His tone was even. Not accusatory, but the point was clear. After the guard left, Michael turned to Thomas. Everything okay with your community service? The teenager nodded. Yes, sir. Today was actually my last day. The store manager offered me a part-time job starting next week. Pride flashed across Michael's face. That's excellent news, Thomas. You've done well. Thanks to you, Judge. Thomas glanced at David. And thanks for stepping in, Officer Reynolds. David smiled. Just doing my job. As Thomas's mother arrived to pick him up, Michael observed the interaction between David and the teenager, the respect evident on both sides, the absence of fear or suspicion. 6 months ago, David might have viewed Thomas the same way the shop guard had, as inherently suspicious, a problem waiting to happen. That was well handled, Michael said as they watched Thomas leave. David shrugged. I learned from the best. Besides, I've gotten to know Thomas a bit. He helps out with the youth basketball league I volunteer with on weekends. This was news to Michael. You're coaching basketball? Assistant coach, David clarified. Mostly I just tie shoelaces and hand out water. But it's a good program. Keeps kids off the streets. Gives them something positive. They walked back toward the elevators together, the courthouse quieting as the day wound down. The Chief Justice called me about joining the Judicial Education Committee, Michael said. It would mean training new judges across the state. You'd be perfect for that, David replied without hesitation. It would also mean less time for Thursday mentoring sessions, Michael added, watching for David's reaction. David nodded thoughtfully. 6 months ago I would have been worried about that. Would have thought I couldn't do this without you holding my hand. He smiled. But you've taught me how to find my own answers. I think I'll be okay. Michael felt a surge of pride, the same feeling he'd had watching Thomas accept the job offer. This was why he'd become a judge in the first place. Not just to apply the law, but to help create the conditions where people could transform their own lives. Besides, David continued with a grin, you're not getting rid of me that easily. I still need help understanding the Commerce Clause. Michael laughed. That makes two of us. Constitutional scholars have been arguing about it for centuries. As they reached Michael's chambers, David paused. Can I ask you something, Judge Michael? Of course. That first day when I stopped you at the entrance, did you ever think we'd end up here? That something good could come from that moment? Michael considered the question. I hoped, he said finally. I've been around long enough to know that sometimes the most important connections start in the most unlikely places. Well, I'm glad you didn't just write me off as some biased cop who didn't know any better. And I'm glad you had the courage to come to my chambers and apologize, Michael replied. It takes strength to admit when you might be wrong. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the distance they'd traveled in 6 months. Not just in their understanding of each other, but in themselves. I should get back to work, David said finally. But I'll see you at the moot court competition next Friday. I'll look forward to it, Michael replied. And David? Thank you for what you did for Thomas today. That matters more than you know. As David walked away, Michael thought about the young officer's question. Had he known something good would come from that tense moment 6 months ago? Perhaps not. But he'd learned over the years to look for possibilities where others saw only problems. In his courtroom and beyond, that perspective had made all the difference. 3 years later, the main courtroom of the county courthouse was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the polished wood and somber portraits of judges past. Family members, friends, courthouse staff, and local officials packed the gallery, an unusual crowd for a Wednesday morning. Judge Michael Taylor sat in the front row, his judicial robes absent today. Instead, he wore a well-tailored dark suit with a blue tie, a gift from his wife for their anniversary. Beside him sat Diane, who had retired as his clerk the previous year but wouldn't have missed this day for anything. Thomas Walker, now in his 3rd year of community college, sat nearby with several other young people who had passed through Michael's courtroom and found their way to better paths. At the stroke of 10, the bailiff called the room to order. All rise for the Honorable Chief Justice Bennett. The Chief Justice entered, his presence commanding immediate respect. He took his place at the bench and surveyed the crowded room with approval. Please be seated, he said. We are gathered today for a very special occasion, the swearing-in of our newest member of the District Court Judiciary. Michael felt a surge of pride as David Reynolds entered from a side door. Gone was the uncertain security officer of 3 years ago. In his place stood a confident man in his early 30s, his face a mixture of solemnity and barely contained joy. He had graduated from law school at the top of his class, then spent 2 years as a public defender before being nominated to the bench, one of the youngest judges ever appointed in the district. Chief Justice Bennett motioned David forward. Today we welcome David Reynolds to our judicial family. His journey to this moment has been unconventional, but remarkable. From courthouse security officer to public defender to the bench in just 5 years, a testament to his extraordinary dedication and ability. The Chief Justice didn't know the half of it, Michael thought. The countless late nights studying, the financial struggles when David quit his security job to focus on law school full-time, the moments of doubt when the path seemed too long and too steep. Michael had witnessed it all, serving as mentor, sometimes tutor, occasionally taskmaster, and always friend. David stepped forward, placing his hand on the Bible held by his mother, a small woman whose eyes shone with tears of pride. As he recited the oath of office, his voice clear and unwavering, Michael remembered their conversations over coffee, their debates about legal theory, the gradual transformation of a man learning to see beyond his own limited perspective. And I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as a judge, according to the best of my abilities and understanding, so help me God. Applause filled the courtroom as David's mother helped him into his judicial robes for the first time. The Chief Justice shook his hand, then stepped aside, giving David a moment to address the gathering. "Thank you all for being here today," David began, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Michael. This journey would not have been possible without the support of many people in this room. But there's one person I must acknowledge above all others. David gestured toward Michael. "Judge Taylor, would you please join me?" Surprised, Michael made his way to the front, shaking hands with David as camera flashes captured the moment. 3 years ago, David continued, addressing the crowd, I was a courthouse security officer with some very narrow views about who belonged where in our justice system. One morning, I stopped Judge Taylor at a side entrance because he didn't fit my idea of what a judge should look like. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the audience, but David pressed on. It could have ended there, just another uncomfortable moment in a long line of such moments in Judge Taylor's life. He could have pulled rank, put me in my place, or simply ignored me. Many would have. David turned to face Michael directly now, his voice thick with emotion. Instead, he invited me to his courtroom. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He challenged me to question my assumptions, to expand my understanding, and ultimately to pursue a dream I had abandoned years before. Michael felt the weight of all eyes in the courtroom, but he focused only on David, on the man he had become, so different from that rigid, suspicious officer. Judge Taylor taught me that justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who enters our courtrooms. It's about creating spaces where change is possible. David turned back to the audience. As I take on this tremendous responsibility, I promise to carry that lesson with me every day, to see beyond my own limited perspective, to recognize that true justice requires not just intelligence and knowledge of the law, but wisdom and compassion. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the high ceilings of the old courtroom. As it subsided, David raised his hand. I have one more announcement today, he said. With the support of the Chief Justice and the County Commissioners, we are establishing the Taylor Mentorship Program for law enforcement and legal professionals. This program will pair officers with judges, public defenders, and prosecutors to build understanding across our justice system. Michael hadn't known about this. He looked questioningly at the Chief Justice, who nodded with a smile. The program will focus particularly on creating pathways to legal careers for officers from diverse backgrounds, David continued. We've secured funding for scholarships to cover law school for 5 officers each year, along with mentorship support throughout their education. David turned to Michael again. Judge Taylor, would you do us the honor of chairing this program? There's no one better qualified to lead it. Before Michael could respond, Thomas Walker stood up from his seat. If I could say something? He asked hesitantly. The Chief Justice nodded, curiosity evident on his face. I was Judge Taylor's defendant once, Thomas said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. I made a stupid mistake as a teenager breaking into a store. Instead of throwing the book at me, he gave me a chance to prove I was more than my worst decision. Thomas looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with several of the young people seated near him. Everyone in this row has a similar story. Judge Taylor saw something in each of us that other people missed. He held us accountable but also gave us paths forward. Some of us are in college now. Some have good jobs. One is even starting law school next fall. A young woman next to Thomas nodded, raising her hand slightly. The point is, Thomas continued, this mentorship program isn't just a nice idea. It changes lives. It changed mine. And Judge Taylor is exactly the right person to lead it. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to Michael. He stood speechless for a moment, moved by the unexpected testimonial and caught off guard by the program announcement. I would be honored to chair this program, he said finally. "Thank you, Judge Reynolds, for this initiative. And thank you, Thomas, for those words." The formalities concluded shortly after, giving way to a reception in the courthouse atrium. As people mingled, enjoying refreshments and conversation, Michael found a quiet moment with David. "You kept that program pretty quiet," Michael said. "How long have you been planning it?" "About 2 years," David admitted with a smile. "I wanted it to be a surprise. It certainly was." "And naming it after me? That wasn't necessary." "Yes, it was," David insisted. "This program exists because of what you taught me. It should carry your name." They were interrupted by a young security officer, a woman in her mid-20s with a determined expression. "Judge Reynolds, I'm Officer Lisa Chen. I wanted to congratulate you and ask about the mentorship program. I've been thinking about law school, but with a baby at home and bills to pay." She trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. David's face lit up. "Officer Chen, you're exactly who this program is designed for. Let me introduce you to Judge Taylor, the program chair." As Michael shook hands with the young officer, he saw in her eyes the same mixture of uncertainty and hope he'd seen in David years ago. The cycle was continuing, expanding beyond what he could have imagined that morning when a suspicious officer had stopped him at the courthouse door. Later, as the reception wound down, Michael found himself alone with the Chief Justice. "You've created quite a legacy, Michael," the older man said, gesturing toward David, who was deep in conversation with a group of young officers. "Far beyond your work on the bench," Michael shook his head. "I just pointed him in the right direction. He did the hard work." "Don't underestimate the power of being seen," the Chief Justice replied. "In my 40 years in the law, I've learned that justice happens one relationship at a time, one recognition of humanity at a time." Michael watched as David laughed at something Thomas said. The new judge and the former defendant now colleagues in a shared vision of what justice could be. "You know," Michael said thoughtfully, "when I became a judge, I thought my impact would be through my rulings, through precedents that might shape the law. I never expected that your greatest contribution would come from a misunderstanding at a side entrance," the Chief Justice finished with a smile. "Something like that," Michael agreed. As he prepared to leave, Michael took one last look around the atrium. Officer Chen was now talking animatedly with Thomas and several other young people. David was speaking with a group of judges, comfortable among his new peers. The courthouse hummed with conversation and connection. What had begun as a moment of tension, a white officer stopping a black judge, had rippled outward, creating widening circles of understanding and opportunity. Michael couldn't have predicted this outcome 3 years ago, but he had recognized a possibility and acted on it. Sometimes, he reflected, that was enough to change a life, or many lives. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed his face as he walked down the courthouse steps, the same steps where this story had begun with a hurried judge and a suspicious officer. Michael paused for a moment, looking up at the words carved above the entrance. "Equal justice under law." Perhaps, he thought, they were a step closer to making those words true.